Supposed Bible contradiction. How many women went to the tomb? One of the most popular alleged contradictions is to point out each gospel says a different number of women went to the tomb on Sunday morning. Matthew says Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to see the tomb. Mark says Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome. Luke says it was Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and additional women. And John only mentions Mary Magdalene. So all agree Mary Magdalene was there, but Matthew adds another Mary. Mark and Luke say this was Mary the mother of James, and Mark adds someone else named Salome, and Luke adds Joanna. So skeptics assert the Gospels are inconsistent and cannot give us a clear picture of who was at the tomb on Sunday morning. However, in reality, skeptics are overplaying their hand. The issue can be sorted out by noting the ancient literary practice of spotlighting. First, it should be obvious, no gospel says only the women I have listed went to the tomb. Since they do not say this, the gospels do not necessarily contradict. Second, take the Gospel of John. It is true he says Mary went to the tomb, but in the very next verse, he reports that Mary said, "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid him." It is unlikely she is referring to herself as a royal plural, and more likely implies there were other women with her. So in reality, both John and Luke are open to there being additional women with Mary. The reason as to why John doesn't mention them has to do with the ancient literary practice called spotlighting. The scholar Mike Licona defines spotlighting as when an author focuses attention on a person so that the person's involvement in a scene is clearly described, whereas mention of others who were likewise involved is neglected. The author has shined his literary spotlight on that person. Think of a theatrical performance. During an act in which several are simultaneously on the stage, the lights go out and a spotlight shines on a particular actor. Others are present but are unseen. In literary spotlighting, the author only mentions one of the people present, but knows of the others. Licona highlights how spotlighting occurs in other ancient works. Specifically, he goes through the lives of Plutarch and compares how Plutarch alone writes each separate biography. Given that Plutarch is the only author of these biographies, we can see how he alone reports the same event in separate accounts. And quite often, Plutarch utilizes spotlighting when he talks about an event in one biography as compared to another. For example, in the life of Cicero, Crassus, Marcellus, and Metellus visit Cicero at night regarding an urgent matter. However, in life of Crassus, Plutarch doesn't mention the other two and spotlights Crassus as the one who goes to Cicero. Later in the life of Crassus, Marcellinus and Domitius ask Pompey and Crassus if they intend to run for consulship. But in life of Pompey, only Marcellinus is mentioned. In the life of Antony, Octavian, Hirtius, and Pansa were sent by the Senate to drive Antony out of Italy. But in life of Brutus, Octavius is spotlighted as the only one. Likewise in the Gospels, they were capable and allowed to employ the device of spotlighting. In John 19:25, he mentions the women standing at the cross, but he does not mention the disciple that Jesus loved as being there as well, even though in the next verse he references him. Luke employs spotlighting by only mentioning Peter running to the tomb, even though John says it was Peter and the beloved disciple. However, later in Luke, on the road to Emmaus, the other disciples say, "Some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said," implying Luke is aware that Peter was not alone when he ran to the tomb. Therefore, when John only mentions Mary going to the tomb, he is probably just spotlighting her. Likewise, Matthew and Mark are probably doing the same thing, spotlighting only some of the women who went. This is not too different than the idea that I could tell you about my trip to Pittsburgh to visit family and omit that my wife and daughter went with me. But if my wife told the same story and mentioned that all three of us went, would our stories contradict? Of course not. We would recognize this as spotlighting. There is no rule that the gospel authors had to mention literally every person involved in every incident that happened with Jesus. Matthew is probably just mentioning the two he felt necessary to get the story across. Mark is probably doing the same, and John probably didn't feel it was necessary to write beyond Mary Magdalene's experience. So considering the ancient literary device of spotlighting, there is no contradiction here. No gospel says, let alone implies, only the women they mention were the ones who went to the tomb, and there is no rule stating they have to mention every woman involved. Also, Richard Bauckham suggests each gospel author only mention the specific women they did because they were careful to name only the women that were known to each author as a witness. If Mark was unaware of Joanna, but Luke was aware of her from another source, Luke could feel safe mentioning her because he had independent verification from another source that was unavailable to Mark. If Matthew was aware of the Gospel of Mark, but could not verify Salome was present there within his own community, he may have simply taken the safe road and omitted her. This implies the Gospel authors may have been careful to include references to people they could only verify from witnesses or authoritative members of the church, instead of being careless in how they recorded things. Bauckham says, "It is natural to suppose that these women were well known not just for having once told their stories, but as people who were made accessible and authoritative sources of these traditions as long as they lived. Which women were well known to each evangelist may have depended on the circles in which that evangelist collected traditions and the circles in which each woman moved during her lifetime. The differences among the gospel narratives of the women's visit to the tomb may well reflect rather directly the different ways in which the story was told by the different women. The omission of Salome by both Matthew and Luke shows that the evangelists did not retain the names of women who had become obscure. Those named by each evangelist were, like their stories, still fresh in the memories of that evangelist's informants, if not the evangelist's own memory. Thus, there is no reason to suppose the Gospels contradict when they report the women as they do. They are more than likely employing the literary device of spotlighting and only mentioning those they felt they needed to get the story across. Or employing this device because they were careful to only mention witnesses they could verify within their communities. Thus, this supposed contradiction can be resolved.